the Black Lives Matter protests being scolded, and the robo-debts. The robo-debts invented by the government here in Australia. It seems so much a waste of lives matter protests by the government scolding and cajoling worldwide at present, expending the Australian government and middle-class privileged white or black energy to stop people protesting over the issue of Aborigines dying in custody in line with the Black Lives Matter movement in America and worldwide. But the point is that black lives do matter, but they are being killed in custody. So they're making it as if they don't matter, even, yes, in Australia. And it must stop as a matter of morals. If the middle class need a reason, since they do not see a reason for the protests or the anger. I think if your children were being choked to death, you wouldn't like it, really. You have to put yourself in the place of the people who are doing this for a reason. It's because of suppressed trauma and anger over the hundreds of years that they've been treated so badly by the people who took their land here in Australia. They took their land, the white colonists, and drove them off, slaughtering them in the protest, and hiding it in the history books from the white kids who grew up here, having no empathy for Aborigines they saw in the street corners as alcoholics and homeless. However, now just as many are also white due to Australia's lack of interest in the poor and oppressed, living on the streets and having no help. But I'm sure if you're the one who had been colonised or enslaved and the culture that took you over was putting you in prison for every misdemeanour, you wouldn't like it, especially if your sons were being choked to death by a culture ruling you. You would be upset, grieved, traumatised, and you would never get over it. So why are they so surprised? But instead, this government is using the virus, the coronavirus, as a way to shut down protests and make everyone afraid of the virus. And yet the Prime Minister still is pushing for borders to be opened and everyone start travelling to Australia, especially the rich Chinese students who need to go back to university and provide the 38 billion or some amount like that to the universities. But have a protest against treating Aborigines badly and letting them die in custody. Oh no, you'd better not do that. You could catch a virus. But everyone can go to the gyms or the public transport or football games or libraries. You can have a party. Now you can have 100 at a funeral or even a wedding. Police have said in New South Wales they'll arrest people who protest for the Black Lives Matter movement or the refugee movement. At the same time, the refugees planning to have a protest as well. The refugees have been held in places here and not allowed to come out. People go on about the virus, but it's about letting the Aborigines have their say against the white oppressors who have held them not only in physical chains for a few hundred years, but mental chains, by not allowing them the freedom to speak and to live, always trying to keep them down and keep the government's foot on the Aborigines' neck. Don't protest, you will catch the virus. What a way to use the fear. Another way to use the fear of the virus is to get everyone to have trackers on their phones, and when that doesn't work and people won't put trackers on, well, we'll go to a McDonald's family restaurant, which I found the other day, and they put a scan code on every table saying, if you don't scan your details into this phone and give us your private details, then we may refuse services. I was somewhat bemused to see the scan code in one of the restaurants, and it said, scan this, and we want your details, and if you don't, we may restrict your interactions or services with you, meaning you can't have your burger and fries. I say, bring it on. Why don't we all just boycott McDonald's and let them lose money instead of letting the government threaten to take your McDonald's food off you if you don't scan your private details from your phone to them? Why scold people and say if everything goes well, restrictions will be lifted? As for Gladys, our Premier of New South Wales, maybe she had planned to lift restrictions already. Because afterwards, now they're saying people can go to football games, so they were trying to put off the protests. Restricting, arresting, fining, threatening, and then saying it's okay, you can all visit each other now and travel wherever you want, whether the virus is around or not. Doesn't it matter? It doesn't matter what the politician. Only matters what the politicians have planned, and they use the virus accordingly. The recent revelation of the robo-debts in Australia through Centrelink, where those recipients of Centrelink payments, the poorer, the jobless, the disabled and the pensioners, were sent aggressive, threatening letters accusing them of owing debts even up to $25,000, is despicable to say the least, particularly since they were in fact made up debts to get the government some revenue. 2016, it was in an ABC News article from 2019. Even worse, these debts which they were accused of being guilty of were made up and not real. Isn't this fraud at the least? But average of the debts according to incorrect payments the Centelink organisation had claimed to had made to recipients, and yet you had to prove that you did not owe them money. In other words, you were guilty, according to them, unless you could prove that you weren't guilty. Shockingly, our own Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was the person who came up with that framework for that robo-debt, along with our fave, Stuart Roberts, in charge of Centrelink now, and in charge also of NDIS, disabilities. Shouldn't they be in prison for fraud? The fact this was caused by made-up debts is so bad. You know, if you were to defraud Centrelink, you were threatened with prison time. What about if the people who run Centrelink defraud it? Politicians, should they do prison time? Good enough for the goose. How dare they hurt their own citizens of Australia by making up stories and debts about them, and then threatening them so much with their aggressive AI robo-debt letters that the already vulnerable young people took their own lives? In an article that I found from ABC from 2019, 2,000 people took their lives, over 2,000, and 430 or more of them were under the age of 35 and were young people who were either on a pension, jobless, couldn't get a job, or had disabilities, and they took their lives after they received those letters. All those letters were sent out. The damage Scott Morrison and the rest of the Australian government did with this incalculable thing they did, how can you trust a man who did that to his own people now, with all his statements, contradictory and weak stories that come out of his mouth, and how can you believe anything that comes out of the mouth of Stuart Roberts? This is fraud and also manslaughter if they indirectly even cause the suicide of recipients who received those threatening, aggressive letters accusing them of debts. This needs to be addressed and justice for the vulnerable be made, as we now have grieving parents who lost their sons pushed over the edge by made-up debts. For shame, how could you? Scott Morrison's recent small apology this week would not have been noticed by those who have died, because they're no longer here, and it doesn't even mean anything. A day of reckoning must come for such leaders, and if they treat people in such a despicable way, they should also have that happen to them. They do not feel the pain of the poor because they have never been poor. To show even more lack of ignorance or empathy, Scott Morrison's mild-mannered statement that there was never any slavery in Australia against Aborigines is a blatant denial of the truth, which was that there was slavery and Aborigines were forced to work for nothing with chains around their necks for the first colonisers, and were chained to each other to dive, and were even forced to dive for pearls by the rich money-monger capitalists who sought to make money out of the people they said were not people. Shockingly, our own Prime Minister was the person who made up the framework for the robo-debt, along with our favourite Stuart Robert, and Christian Porter was named with Matthias Cormann, all men of white privilege living off taxpayers' money themselves. How crass to oppress the vulnerable so much that many of them suicided between 2016 and 2018. 400 plus the age of 35 years old who were under the age of 35 who were on centelink payments. There needs to be a day of reckoning, and people need to pay for what they did, including Scott Morrison, and it should not be allowed to get away with it. All the best, Andrea.